e ngā mana, e ngā reo, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Annabelle taku ingoa. My name's Annabelle Macalear. I'm the Senior Communications Advisor here at Our Land and Water. Welcome to the final webinar in our 4-part series. Thanks for making the time to join us today. We've put together the series of webinars called the Better Together webinar series to share research that brings together scientists, farmers, growers, iwi, policymakers, primary industry bodies, businesses and communities to care for our land and water. So today's webinar, we're going to be talking about land use diversification. For some catchments that are under a lot of pressure, and for some farmers, changing the intensity of production or the use of some land is going to be a more sensible management response than continuing to invest in on-farm mitigations. For a bit of context to the conversation today, if you didn't catch our second webinar, what the data tells us about our water, try and find some time to watch that sometime. It introduced an interactive map that shows the catchments in New Zealand that are under the most pressure, in the case of that particular map from nitrogen, and gives an indication of the extent to which applying all known mitigations will ease this pressure. We have about 15 minutes for a Q&A at the end of today's webinar, so you can submit your questions as a Q&A button at the bottom, and we'll answer them at the end of the webinar. We'll also add you to the recipient list for our e-newsletter. It comes out about 5 or 6 times a year, and there's an unsubscribe link there if you don't want to receive it anymore. So I'll jump straight to introducing the speakers and we'll get started. So first we will hear from Phil Journeax. He's an agricultural economist at AgFirst and co-lead of one of our Rural Professionals Fund projects. It's a bit of a mouthful. It's called Facilitating Farmer Economic Understanding of Alternative Land Uses and the Barriers to Adaptation and Land Use Change, which is what he's going to be talking about today. He'll share the farmer perspective of kind of the why farmers are interested in land use diversification. Then we'll hear from Susan Goodfellow, who's the Director of Left Field Innovation and the case study lead, one of the case study leads in the Next Generation Systems Research program that wrapped up a little while ago. Susan's going to share some outcomes of her research that connected farmers, industry and consumer insights. Then we'll hear from Sam Lang, who's the manager of Quorum Sense and co-lead of our Regenerative Agriculture think piece. He's going to speak about the benefits to farmers of collaborating and sharing knowledge and his sense of what working together has done for community and well-being. And finally, Tataru White of Te Arawa is a member of our brand new Pahiwa Pai Tawhiti program that we'll look forward to telling you more about next year. Tataru is chair of Te Tātou o Te Arawa and part of the group Te Arawa Vision 2050. Just a little bit of background about the Pahiwa Pai Tawhiti program. It's aiming to help people with a new vision for their land use communicate and share that vision with the intention to help everyone involved in decision making have better conversations and reach robust decisions. So quite a good lineup. We'll start off with Phil. Phil, would you like to get started?
Thanks, Annabelle. Hi, everyone. Just bear with me 10 seconds while I... Oh, sorry. Get this technology. Yes, as Annabelle mentioned, what I'd like to do is talk about this, well, land use change diversification project. It runs for 6 months. We've only just started it. We've got 12 pastoral farmers who we're working with. The objectives, as you can see on the screen there, are around increasing the economic understanding around alternative land uses, encouraging a due diligence process when they're looking at such alternatives, understanding the motivations, if you like, for changing land use, and understanding the barriers that farmers are likely to come up against when they're considering land use change. So the process we're working with is we've got 3 workshops planned. We've recently held the first. which is really a discussion around understanding why they were looking at land use change, what options A, that are available, and B, what they are considering. Talk through the issues that they need to think about as they go through this whole process, if you like. And in particular, we've prepared a due diligence process that we use through this process, which we provided to the farmers and talked them through that. And I think I can say that the reaction was one of holy cow, I hadn't thought of much of this. And a key component of that, if you like, which sort of feeds into Susan's talk coming up, is to look at the value chain of the industry that you're thinking to get in, because that has a huge bearing on the likelihood of success. The second workshop, which we'll have in February, is really a discussion on the process to date. We've got one farmer, sheep and beef farmer, who's looking at kiwi fruit. He's well into the process, so we'll use him as a guinea pig to talk through what he's been doing and the issues he's come up against, and use that to leverage with the others. And we've also got a number of experts to come along and talk to the group. In particular, a person who understands the how would you put it, the water regulations in the region, because they are probably going to be the biggest impediment. And also a farmer who's made the change, and he'll talk through what process they went through. And then the last workshop will really be around how far they've got down the process, if you like. Have they changed land use? Are they still thinking about it? What were the barriers they came up against, and how they managed to work around that? In terms of we talked to them about the reasons for change, and I'd have to say the main motivating factor really was around the sort of economic, or what I'd call economic issues. Some are looking at diversification as a risk management strategy. Others were particularly looking at increasing their overall income, if you like. One or a couple of them were very much working through a succession planning exercise, and the whole thing was to make sure that the farming business was that much more sustainable financially. Others were looking for a challenge, if you like, pretty settled in what they're doing now, but looking at something new as a means to stimulate them further. A number looking at the environmental impact, or lessening the environmental impact of the current system. Noting that most of them, what they were looking at would actually result in a lower environmental impact anyhow. But in saying that, guys, not all of them will have a lower environmental impact. We talked to them about expectations of the barriers that they're likely to come up against. Probably the first one that came up was the financial side. Did they have the capital cash flow to get through? Secondly, whether they had the skills within themselves, and the human capital side, which is probably more around the labour. Can they access skilled labour to make the business a good proposition? And I'd have to say some of them were thinking, we thought it was a good idea, but we're not 100% sure of it as yet. Probably one of the real key issues that came up was around this access to information. If you're looking at a change, where do you go to find the information you want? If you're looking at an established export-orientated industry, and the classic is probably kiwi fruit, usually there's some information around, particularly financial, because it was the key one that a lot of people were looking for. The issue, though, is if you're looking at a domestic-orientated industry, and the key one up in this neck of the wood would be berries. It's very competitive, and a lot of the participants aren't very keen on sharing information. And then if you're looking at something entirely new, for example, around hemp, Yes, you can find information on how to grow it, but not necessarily much around the financials. And the other information is a lot of the information that tends to be very dispersed. And I suspect for a lot of the farmers, they're going to have fun, you know, trawling through the web and bringing up people and all the rest of it, trying to dig all that up. And then the other thing, just to help us track through how thinking's changed and that as we go on, we've developed a standardised questionnaire that they're filled in at this workshop, and we'll do so at the next. So looking at those things around motivation for change, what are the options they've thought about, whether they know much about the options, what are the barriers they've come up against and how they've got around that. And the last one, their partners in the process, that's more around who they've talked to get information and advice. A lot of them try and keep it well within the family, so to speak. But a lot of these processes, you need to get out and talk to a whole range of people, particularly those that are existing in the industry already. So that's about me. I'll close there and hand over to Susan.
Thank you, Phil. I'll just get my screen share organised. Can we see? Have we got that on screen? No?
We can. Yep, it's great.
Okay, for some reason I can't see it, so that's not very convenient. Can you still see it? Sorry. Can someone give me some feedback?
Yep. Yes, sorry, I was on mute. Yes, we can see it. Yep.
Thank you. Okay. Look, thank you for this opportunity, and actually thank you, Phil, for your introduction, because you have just given a beautiful overview of why Left Field Innovation was actually established in the first place. We recognise that, hold on, I'm having trouble with my, here we go. We recognise there's a real challenge around land use diversification to more higher value and sustainable opportunities if you're relying on an individual farmer to make that change, given that, you know, there's so many parts to actually understand and overcome. And we saw the opportunity to develop an entity that would do the research and development, would look at the market insights, understand what consumers want, understand what we can grow sustainably, and then develop those partnerships with food companies to global markets. We have an ambition of enabling 100,000 hectares of sustainable land use across New Zealand for farmers. So in that context, we joined up with our Land and Water Science Challenge, the Next Generation Systems team, with Robin Dines and Paul Johnson for 2 projects. Well, actually there was 3. There were 2 projects in Canterbury and 1 project in the Warapa. And it really, the first project in Canterbury was engaging with farmers to look at some of those barriers that Phil just raised. And really understanding, well, what's the first thing we need to do around understanding the individual as a farmer, their values and what their drivers are. And they went through a process to identify the values through a multi-criteria decision-making assessment. But one of the key themes that came out from that discussion was, please can you start with things that we know we can produce on the land? Because they understood that starting with something that was a bit different would require a lot more capital investment, potentially on farm and off farm, which was seen to be a barrier. From there, that took us to a deep dive into a market insight study around specialty grains and pulses. And the purpose there was to say, how can we capture more value from what we know we can grow, which was a suite of specialty grains and pulses. And then building on that further, working with a group of Warapa farmers around future farm systems and what were the drivers behind that, really built on the work we had done in Canterbury. And where farmers were really clear on why they needed to change. The environmental and economic situation needed to be addressed. They generally knew what they needed to do, and that centred around needing to participate beyond the farm gate and really look at how they could capture more value in terms of more in-market value. But the real barrier, as Phil has identified, was how do they actually do that? And so I'd like to talk through some of those lessons learned and insights today. Some of the key themes here were around being market-led. And this came through for both groups of farmers in Canterbury and the Warapa. But the need to, we can grow lots of things on the land, but is there a market? Are there consumers that want it? So instead of thinking about what we can produce or grow on our land, we start with the market and have a lens of where are those consumers that care? What are the attributes they care about? What are the forms potentially that these raw ingredients can be turned into that they value? And from there, I've just lost my PowerPoint.
Sorry, Susan, that is me. Your slides weren't changing, so I've taken over.
Okay, right. So that's all
and
good.
Let me know if I'm on the right screen and when I need to advance.
Okay, thanks. And so the market part is critical, to start with the market. Then you say, well, given what we know the market wants, can we grow this suite of, potentially it could be vegetables, it could be other horticulture, it could be crops or various animals. Can we grow that sustainably on our land? What land is suitable to accommodate these opportunities? So that becomes the next environmental filter. That's where you go, no go to the next step. And the final step is how can we add more value to these raw materials? So that was very much centered around the Canterbury group. Interestingly, the Warapa group around future farm systems, what came out there was actually mindset's massive. As an individual, if you haven't got your mind open to change and why you need to change, and being you realize where your strengths and weaknesses are and where those opportunities are that you need to collaborate with others to cover off things that you perhaps aren't your strengths and skills, is a really critical first step. Obviously that leads to collaboration and working together at catchment scales to be able to grow things to meet the market at scale. And the importance of data came through really strongly in terms of telling that provenance story that's underpinned by data that actually gives some evidence of how what they've produced has been grown. So that sort of overview is really starting at the end, but it gives you sort of a snapshot of, a few things that we found really, really important. So just moving on to consumer values, which really is important. Annabelle, if you could do that. There you go. It's really important for us to understand the emerging consumer values and the importance, the role that farmers play in the provenance story in relation to those values. So established values around taste, convenience and nutrition are things that farmers have less ability to influence from a provenance point of view, but they certainly have potential to influence or convey the emerging values which centre around nutrition from a food safety perspective, but also the environmental and ethical values, which is around the production impacts of what they're producing on their land, food waste, the ethical values around fair wage and animal welfare. So they're really important to have visibility around in terms of linking to capturing data. So Leafield's strategy, which actually was developed out of engaging with the Canterbury farmers, when they said, look, where do we start with this land use diversification, journey? And the focus around how do we capture more value from what we know we can grow really started to underpin the way Leafield undertook our market insight work. So we had the modules of, what does the market want? What are the attributes? But very importantly is what processing capability and what companies exist within a region, because the proximity is important around logistics and cost to link with market. What exists that we can create new partnerships, a new way of working to transform those raw materials into something of higher value in the first instance. So we get some real near-term impact and change happening and that farmers, it's relatively easy for them to step into. And the separate but parallel strategy is around value creation, and that's where we're creating new value In relation to potentially land uses where processing capability or plant varieties or what have you don't currently exist, so there's a lot more investment and research required to create those new opportunities. And that's a slightly longer term play. It has potential to have a lot more significant economic impact, but it's further out. So by focusing on value capture, we're able to get some easy wins, which is essentially what our near-term opportunities for value study around grains and pulses for the Canterbury group enabled. So we were already working with a 5,000 hectare grower group in Canterbury with a global company, Nish and Sufin Group, who have a champion milling here in Canterbury. We redesigned that relationship to a 5-year supply agreement. We use farmer data to create provenance and traceability through an app. And based on that group, we were able to then trial some of their specialty grains and pulses. And out of that study, we identified 6 star crops of oats, quinoa, G-free soy, chickpeas, buckwheat, and hemp. We looked at over 20 different crops. And for various reasons, these ones were the ones that made it through all of the filters that we looked at. Some of the key drivers for these crops were import replacement and the risks that importing some of these crops had for New Zealand around a biosecurity incursion of bringing in a pest or disease. And some of the import companies were very keen to procure these grains and pulses from New Zealand, but the challenge being they needed robust certainty of around the grower capability that they would deliver. So hence the grower group was really, really important. And of course, again, as part of that evaluation was what is the processing capability that exists within the North and the South Island that can turn these raw materials into something exciting. So the outcome of that is ongoing trials. We've had trials for quinoa, soy, chickpeas, buckwheat, and oats underway, and they're all scaling up this year, and further trials for next year. We've had a Japanese customer procure the buckwheat for high-value noodles in Japan. So some really exciting things that have got farmers already on the journey to land use diversification. They are fitting well within a mixed farm system. They add value in terms of nitrate uptake and reducing inputs required to grow these crops. So there's some exciting opportunities. We still need more science to support their performance long term and continue to engage with the next generation systems team on improving those outcomes. So back to the Warapa. This was, as I said, the farmers generally know why they need to change. It's the economic challenges, it's the environmental pressures. They need to do things differently on their land. They have got some ideas in terms of what they could do. They generally know what the best part of their farmers and the worst part of their farmers and what their land is suitable for. But the real big questions that came through was, how do we do this? Working beyond the farm gate and that whole value and supply chain to market is really challenging. And for most of them, it was beyond their skill set. So how do we work together and collaborate to actually enable this to happen? And there were a number of themes. There were 8 themes that come out of these surveys that we did with them. But the 3 prominent ones that really were sort of like the first step was mindset, business models, and trusted data. So just moving on to mindset. As I said at the opening of the talk, knowing yourself and your own limitations and your own blind spots and weaknesses and strengths is really, really important, particularly if you're starting to think about working collectively with other farmers, whether it's to achieve scale, to enable you to rotate sustainably different crops or land uses on your farm and achieve scale to meet the market. So you've got to be able to work effectively with other farmers and other people or other food companies, for example. And so understanding your values and drivers and making sure that you're working with people where there is alignment so that there's more of a guarantee of a successful relationship and outcome was seen to be really, really important. So what are the tools in the toolbox that we can offer to farmers to really help them have that visibility around their strengths and where their mindset's at? And that linked back to the multi-criteria decision-making assessment that the Canterbury farmers participated in, and that now the Warapa farmers are participating in right at the moment. From mindset, we built on business model. So the farmers getting their head around the need to participate beyond the farm gate. And when you start to look at value chains, you see that the farmers are at one end, the consumer is at the other end. And most farmers are operating within the farm gate. There are some that sort of step out and get involved in cooperatives and other types of arrangements that allow them to capture a little bit more value. But our recent work has showed, when we analyse food products, that generally based on a commodity model, farmers are getting around 2% margin of that in market value. So there's a huge amount of room for improvement. If we just start to be creative and think about business models that redesign that supply chain into a value web, where farmers are connected more closely to consumers and capture more value. Part of capturing value is provenance and connecting New Zealand food provenance to the products that we produce domestically and for export as well. And this is another shift in mindset, saying, well, let's capture that data that farmers use for compliance currently, particularly in Canterbury. And that data can include things like nutrient efficiency, water use efficiency, greenhouse gas emissions, soil quality, agri-chemical use, social responsibility in terms of the ethical aspects of fair wage and that sort of thing, animal welfare, biodiversity. So all of this information is sitting there, used for regulatory purposes. How can we flip this over and use this to actually provide some value in relation to food provenance? And we know that consumers who care about the environment, they really care, and Sam will talk to this shortly, around soil health and how our production affects our soil. And so agri-chemical use has become one of the top things that consumers who care are worried about, in terms of how can we source food that doesn't have any agri-chemicals. So there's a real challenge there around farm system change, but capturing that data and being able to tell that story. We've developed a QR code based app to do that via a separate project, but it all starts to link together in the importance of provenance. And some of the work that we've recently done around the business model show that linking authentic provenance underpinned by data to food, there's potentially a 7% margin that can be captured on that food. So that's a clear first step that can happen for farmers going forward. So I'm probably nearing time up, but I think that the concept is around, working together better, is having a systems approach, where we are market informed, we're environmentally focused, and our work is supported by science. That really is going to be a game changer in how our farmers go forward in the future. So thanks to our Land and Water team and Next Generation Systems, and we look forward to taking some of the lessons learned from this project into the work we have in front of us going forward.
Thanks, Susan. I will make your slides available on our website, and in the events section. We've got an event set up for this webinar. So if anyone, I think I slightly lagged your presentation, so I'll make them available so people can have a look for themselves.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks for that. Nice to follow on from Phil and Susan. Yeah, Annabelle introduced me briefly just before. I guess what I was asked to focus on was mostly the role of community in supporting diversification. And I suppose I think about diversification at multiple levels, right from what's happening in a square foot of soil and a square metre of pasture, for example, right through to different enterprises, different landscape components, etc. And I think that was nicely illustrated by the different scales that Phil and Susan were both respectively focused on there. I guess I've got a couple of hats today in terms of suppose where my perspective comes from. Initially, I got interested in support networks after a Nuffield scholarship in 2016, which was 9 months travel around the world. And what I was interested in at that time was how do we actually support communities, farming communities, through systems change fundamentally, and what does that look like in the concepts of sustainable agriculture? And I had a really broad lens, and to be honest, didn't have a huge amount of experience in that field. And kind of as I was traveling around visiting lots and lots of farmers and groups of farmers, some that had all that had challenges going through various system changes in different contexts, but you start to pick up patterns. And one of the kind of most obvious patterns that I picked up was the importance of farmers talking about just these kind of quiet comments about how important it was that it might have been their cricket team as opposed to their farming community, for example, who really believed in what they were doing, or even better, they had a group of farmers, whether they were local or whether they were spread around the district or the country or increasingly the world with online connectivity, about how important that was, just partly for their learning and also just for that sort of sense of confidence, just to keep them going, and keeping them connected to that kind of long-term vision that they were working towards. Because I guess if you think about regenerative agriculture in a very broad context, which is kind of where all of this travel led me to, it's really farmers trying to work with complex living systems, and rather than simplifying them down to something manageable, it's okay, how do we work with that complexity? And that comes with challenges in terms of we hear this a lot these days around, just how much more farmers need to know and understand in order to effectively work with these systems when they're making shifts towards what you might broadly classify as a regenerative farm system. And just on that note, because I know it's a contested term and we don't put a huge amount of, we're not overly attached to it, but I think we're stuck with it for a while. But that's just in terms of how I see the concept, I suppose. You're looking at a whole lot of different knowledge systems, philosophies, farm systems, practices, etc., that are all being brought together. And I think what you see is farmers and growers that are working in a broad regenerative agriculture context, integrating parts of all of those kind of things and bringing them together. And you'll notice that mainstream farming practices are a significant part of that as well. So it's not any kind of black and white distinction that we're talking about here. It's always a shift and it's always integrated. But for those that are familiar with the terminology, farmers talk a lot about principles as opposed to focusing on practices. And one of the principles, I suppose, or some of the principles are really underpinned by what you might call a culture and mindset. And so it's nice that Susan was talking about mindset there, because it's quite a nice segue. So how is regenerative agriculture spreading around the world and also in New Zealand? And there's lots of similarities in my experience. And as I mentioned just then, if you look at what's interesting and consistent, whether you're looking at what's happening in South Otago or at a New Zealand level or at a global level, there really is these kind of consistent patterns in terms of culture and mindset. And to be a bit more specific, the kind of things we see these networks really valuing is things like open-mindedness, being hyper-inclusive with the people that are participating in these support networks, really trying to remove the judgment from conversations, making people feel safe to be fairly vulnerable and share both what's working, but also, and perhaps more importantly, what's not. And really encouraging people to focus on what they've learned from failure rather than seeing failure as a failure in and of itself. And being really possibility focused, so positive solutions oriented, really dwelling in what they can do and be proactive about, as opposed to dwelling in what's hard or challenging or annoying. And part of that is just really is valuing different perspectives. And I think that was perhaps reflected in the previous diagram. We've got all these different philosophies and values and worldviews and that, and actually taking an approach that everybody and every philosophy and worldview has got value to add to what we're doing if we can listen to it, and we can take from it what we feel is relevant and appropriate to what we're doing. So at one level, it's about culture and mindset, and another, I suppose, just digital connectivity has been hugely powerful in the last few years for really enabling this growth of regenerative agriculture. And I know it's not confined to regenerative ag whatsoever. We're seeing that across the board. Where the, I suppose, some interesting things we're observing is that digital connectivity is really empowering this peer-to-peer, farmer-to-farmer knowledge sharing and the ability to bounce off each other as kind of independent, trusted peers. There's obviously been a lot of, I suppose, what the difference being probably a less reliance on experts as the primary providers of or holders of knowledge, for example, and that includes commercial providers that obviously have an interest in selling either services or products. And this, I guess, these social networks, whether it's a WhatsApp chat or a Facebook group or even just email groups and things like that, just really creating the ability for farmers to talk directly to each other with a really low transactional cost, and the ability to have that private or public, depending on them. And yeah, that seems to, I guess, all these things that kind of appear subtle are in fact seem to have quite massive impacts when you put them all together. And what we're seeing out of that is just, well, I suppose in my kind of main day job, where I'm managing effectively a support network, or a digital and in-person network of farmers and others around the country, is just all these stories of farmers getting kind of re-excited about farming and what they're doing, or young farmers or kids from farming families that were actually never really interested in taking over, getting into the family farm, for example, because it just wasn't something interesting. And that was a couple of months ago. I had 4 stories of farmers telling me that their kids had been planning to go and do engineering or marketing or go off and do this and that. And something about the excitement of the regenerative ag space has actually changed their mind, or kind of given them some kind of inspiration for actually going farming. And so yeah, those are all quite cool. So in terms of what this looks like on the ground, I suppose context is really important, as with anything. And so there is, this is what I suppose people struggle to define regenerative ag, which is frustrating for some, but actually everything's going to look different everywhere, because every farm, climate, and person is different, so they're going to take different approaches. I guess what they're focusing on is, when we're coming back to the theme of diversification, is, as I said earlier, diversity right from what's in a teaspoon of soil to in your pastures or in your crops, your crop rotations, and then moving out to a landscape level. So how are you integrating different layers of plant species primarily, I suppose? So is it shrubs, trees, wetlands, etc., into those landscapes? And I think the interesting thing about the regen space is that all of those are thought about. And I think my particular personal interest is actually, how do we integrate these shrubs and trees into our landscapes in a more nuanced way, perhaps. So instead of thinking about them in blocks and places, actually, what does a hill country landscape look like that's actually got a intentionally designed tree and shrub systems, for example, throughout it, that actually improve the productivity of the whole and resilience of the whole. And I think we've got a huge amount of potential to do that. But again, as a little case study, the knowledge demands, the knowledge requirements in terms of what species are going to grow where and how you plant them and maintain them, and the economics that Phil was talking about, because that can be an extremely expensive activity, not only sourcing the trees and planting them, but then also protecting them and looking at what actually those return on investments look like over time. And are there different ways of financing them through carbon or water credits and things like that? So that's, to me, that's a rapidly evolving space. And yeah, I suppose I probably should touch on, I suppose most of those examples I was talking about before in terms of culture and digital connectivity are really strongly reflected in the Quorum Sense Farming Network, which is my primary day job. So forgot to mention that before. And just finally, one of my other hats is working in science, as Annabelle mentioned, and a white paper that's about to come out around regenerative agriculture. Oh, I think it's coming out early next year. And in terms of how research can work with these kind of support networks, I suppose some of the key things we've taken out of it is around focusing on intentionally integrating different knowledge systems within transdisciplinary research approaches. So rather than seeing science, for example, as a primary knowledge system that takes precedence or has a higher value than, you know, the knowledge of farmers or Māori or market people in market, for example, it's actually what happens if we construct a level playing field there and recognise all those knowledge systems as equal and find ways to work together. And I guess working in the real world as much as possible. So instead of taking our experiments out of the real world and into research farms and lab experience and that, can we work in the real world as much as possible with you know, commercial farms that are part of supply chains that are connected to markets and consumers, for example, and that poses challenges in terms of some of the ways that we've done a lot of our research historically, but considering the speed and scale of change these days, we're kind of thinking that approach is going to be a lot faster and a lot more relevant if we're actually looking for driving impact and change over time. So I think that's me, and I hope I was on time, and I think I'm handing over to Te Taru.
Hi, kia ora no tātou. In terms of screen sharing, I'm it, that profile you're seeing right here. But I want to pick up on what Sam said around novel research, grassroots connectivity, innovation, knowledge systems, and real world. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of an insight into the real world of Māori and how we look at decision making and what our aspirations are under the umbrella of what is a pretty fresh and I think an exciting program called Pohio Pai Tawhiti, which is basically visualizing horizons. How do we see our land being developed in a way that captures the well-being of our people and actually balances it with commercial endeavors? So cultural, social, environmental, and commercial. How do those all balance out? And so the project itself is looking at developing tools that can enable that level of decision making to be made, where we can design models that reflect well-being. In our case, we would refer to them as MODI, a particular essence that binds all of those factors. And how can we measure that in the context of the decisions we need to make? Quite frankly, right now, we are groups of people who sit around the table as land trusts and corporations. We can grow our assets, and it's quite sexy to be able to develop the commercial element of it. But how does that balance against feeding our people socially, culturally, and then developing, of course, and maintaining an environmental footprint that's acceptable? And when you think about that in the context of the government's current moves for the National Policy Statement on Freshwater Management and Climate Change, it fits very nicely into that type of program. So we've developed this particular program in partnership with Scion, Ag Research, Manaki Whenua, and Niwa, after lengthy discussions to try and get it balanced and got it right and aligned with other programs in the system. We've got there. And so in the new year, we'll be rolling it out. And so Te Arawa, my people, and this is largely around the Rotorua Lakes District, where we've got 14 lakes in a very sensitive area. A number of our land trusts and corporations are coming together to participate in this program to develop a model that can actually do what I've just said, measure the implications of what we do against those well-being factors. And so we've gone some way to developing what is referred to as a MODI model, one that can actually do that and how we can apply that. In a sense that if we could do something like this and capture those values in the way we do business, then it can be developed it can be expanded into the catchment level, potentially at national level, and hopefully not just be picked up by Māori, but picked up by mainstream as well. Because I fundamentally believe, and we do believe, that farmers have it in their mindset that they want to do the best for the environment as well. And if they can improve employment, they can improve education in these spaces, then that's the way we should go. And so really that's basically it. And we're dealing with Te Arawa, we're talking about, in the case of this particular study, we have access to 30,000 hectares of land being developed in the primary sector, be it forestry, horticulture, agriculture. And so, and when I talk about values, the fundamental values of culture, to me, would blanket those land trusts and corporations. They would think along those same value lines. how they might practice their business ultimately, and how they might diversify from what they're doing now will be up to them to see how they might balance this within the context of the decision tool that we're building at the moment. So we're looking to a brighter future that does all of that. And as I said before, you know, we are also anticipating that tsunami of requirements that are coming down the government pathway as being really important matters that we need to be ahead of the game and not just behind it and following it. And I think largely we're in a good position to do that. So really, when I look at our land trusts and the corporations and the way we make decisions right now, our members are elected from thousands of beneficiaries out there. They get put onto a land trust and a corporation to make the decisions, right? And so it's a bit of a mix sometimes as to the ability and the capability of people on those groups to make the decisions equitably, if you like. You usually get maybe 2 out of 3 or 4 out of the 7 that know where everything is at, but the balance really struggle to keep up. With a tool that we're hoping to develop, they can visualize and see you know, how these decisions are being applied to deal with the constant conversations we are having with our people. Is how is it increasing our employment? How are we building our education amongst our young people? How are we succeeding our young people into this place? How is the footprint looking in the context of our lakes that we want to preserve? How is it looking full stop across all of that? And then, of course, how are you making enough money to feed back to our people? So getting that balance right is critical. And this is what this program seeks to do. So I'm really enthused by it. I know that our partners are enthused by it. We've got it all set up now. So come the new year, we'll be rolling it out. And I'm looking forward to doing just that. So Annabelle, I mean, I'm trying to put it in a nutshell. I know we're running out of time and we've got questions to be answered. So I'd like to switch it back to the group. I think I've fundamentally put it in a nutshell, hopefully that people can understand. And I look forward to any questions that might come forward. Kia ora tātou.
Kia ora Tataru, thank you for that. As you might have noticed, I've switched rooms because my computer completely froze, so I'm now in Rich's office. But in doing so, I can no longer see any of the Q&A that have previously been submitted. So I'm going to throw it over to, let's say you, Phil. I know that there was at least one question that came in for you right at the start that it looked like you answered over text. And I didn't see what it was, sorry, but if it was something that the rest of the audience might be interested in, perhaps you could answer that verbally.
Yeah, sure. The question was around, would we be providing, go back a step, at the end of the project, will we be providing recommendations around what farmers can look at to overcome the various barriers that they might come up against? Short answer to that is yes, we will. That's part of the intention of the whole project. And the second part of the question was just to remind the questioner where the trial is. It's Waikato based. We're strictly looking at farming within the Waikato.
Okay, thank you, Phil. Now there's a question here for Susan, re a mindset that looks for win-wins. Do we have the political regulatory framework that supports this thinking? Thanks for that question from Elizabeth McGrady.
Oh, look, thanks, Elizabeth. I actually think probably not. I think it's quite siloed in terms of how we approach land from a policy perspective, in relation to a market perspective, in relation to trying to create those win-wins. So I think that there's some real potential to improve that going forward, that would enable farmers to lead with using, you know, their performance in relation to market performance to, you know, fulfill the regulatory requirements. I think at the moment it's completely disconnected and it's not incentivized. I think there's some real opportunity to link that up.
Great, thank you. Now, this question here, yeah, I'm not quite sure who this is for, about farmers being included in the conversation about how their land may be impacted by the effects of natural hazards. I don't know if any of your projects are particularly looking at that. Susan, is that something that's come up in conversation, or Phil, is that something that comes up in conversation with farmers? Are they concerned about climate change, flooding, that sort of change over time?
Well, I'll have first cut at it, Annabelle, because I've some experience from previous work. Yes, they are concerned. It's interesting, though. I'd say the first step in terms of farmers being involved in those discussions is actually to do some due diligence and find out what the natural hazards may or may not be on the property that you're farming. And if I could give it some examples, there was some flooding in the Waikato a couple of years ago. There was big flooding that some people may remember in 2004 in the Waikato. And some farmers got a very nasty surprise when the council rang up and says, you're on a designated floodplain and we're opening our floodgates to stop the flooding. And that's the first I'd heard of it. So little right of the clause, if you like, if you're buying a farm, do your due diligence so you know what you're facing. But coming back to the answer, you really need to get into discussions with your district council and your regional council about what those natural hazards are and what you may be able to do about it.
And just to build on Phil's comments, I think different regions potentially are more advanced than others. In Canterbury, for example, with farm environment plans and farmers requiring to do that risk assessment on farm, but also look broadly at what are some of those risks and how they might manage or mitigate. So I think there is starting to become frameworks in relation to that, but I do believe that different regions are at different levels in terms of how they respond and how advanced they are in relation to that process.
Thank you. Jenny's just helpfully printed out all the questions and put them through to me. So there is another one from Elizabeth McGrady, which I think is a really important question. To what extent is reliable or unreliable access to water a motivator or a barrier to land use diversification? Susan, could you tackle that one, please?
Yeah, look, we've been doing quite a lot of work in this space, and if you take it from a market perspective, and at the end of the day, farmers need some economic return from what they produce off their land. We have found that from the market end, from the manufacturers, processors, customers, they are very keen to procure raw materials from farmers who have reliable water, because in the past they have been bitten by farmers signing up a contract, a supply agreement to deliver a product, and they can't fulfill it because it's been a drought and they haven't been able to produce that product. So under the reliable water gives reliable supply or certainty of supply, and that's come through very, very clear that in areas where they are subject to dry weather, reliable water is key, and we're seeing with the effects of the changing climate that regions that may not have been affected in the past by dry weather events are now becoming more affected. So reliable water really does underpin that certainty of supply.
Yeah, and if I can, oh, you go, Phil.
Sorry, Sam. No, if I could just comment, Annabelle, and I mean, what is absolutely crucial, within the Waikato, we've got over 900,000 hectares of high quality soils, and we can grow a lot of horticultural crops on that land. But the vast majority need irrigation, upwards of 5,000 cubes per hectare. In most instances, we don't have the water, in which case that option is just not on the table. So it has a major factor in terms of what options we can look at. Sorry, Sam.
Yeah, cheers, Phil. I suppose just with a lot of the farmers we're working with, even just with the existing commodity crops and things that they're producing, or in the context of the arable farmers, they are growing a lot of high value seeds and that kind of things, but actually looking at water through a slightly different lens, which is, well, it's one thing, how much falls out of the sky or we can put on with an irrigator is one thing, but the next question is how much of that do we actually infiltrate and how much of it can we hold on to and utilize and produce. And so as we're seeing farmers going out doing water infiltration tests, for example, in different seasons and over time to try and see if they can actually increase the speed. So if you get a 50 mil thunderstorm in the middle of January, you can take it all in, whereas there's certainly a lot of cases around the place where you might catch 5 of that if it falls thick and fast, depending on what that how that soil and plants have been managed. And the same is true for thinking about, I remember talking to an ag research scientist a couple of years ago for a separate project, thinking about what's one of the big gaps that we're not paying a huge amount of attention to in our hill country farming as far as opportunities. And his view was actually the impact of wind sucking the moisture out of our hill country, for example, and how do we think about integrating trees in a way that can actually actually help us hold more moisture through those risk periods, for example. So I think there's a lot of lots of different ways to look at water.
Yeah, I would suggest also that they keep close watch on the national policy statement for freshwater management. That'll actually come down in regulatory requirements. Wearing another hat briefly, I'm a regional council on the Bay of Plenty Regional Council, and we are seeing this coming across our table every day. And the high level of engagement that's expected of the regional councils to engage with farmers and others alike is really, really important. So we can talk about access to water, but those regulations are going to be really, really important to keep a tab on.
Thanks, Tataru. There's just one kind of follow-up question on that about the term dryland farming. Are you familiar with that, Sam?
Yep, what was the
term dryland farming is fashionable. What might that practically mean?
I've always assumed that that's just land that's not irrigated. And Phil's nodding his head, so he's probably got a better take on that than I do.
Yeah, exactly as Sam said, Annabelle, it's farming without irrigation. And I guess the best example in New Zealand would be some of the sheep and beef and cropping land in Canterbury, where they don't have irrigation, so they have to farm reasonably conservatively and very much in tune with the sort of the seasons, if you like, given that on average they're going to get a very dry summer.
Yeah. Okay, I think we've covered all the questions that I can see, at least.
Just one final comment, if I may.
Annabelle. Sure, yeah.
Just to follow up on the comment I made, people would have heard this phrase, te mana o te wai, right? That's there big time, and people are really rolling their eyeballs on what does that really mean. Basically, it puts the water first, the health of the water first, and actually looking at the economy of things, it comes a little after that. So it's really, really how people can focus on and showing, a really sound footprint when it comes to use of water. And so that's, again, that term te mana o te wai will give more and more provenance as we move forward. And hopefully people will be able to clarify what it means and how it's to be applied and what the outcomes might be from that.
Thanks, Tataru. Yeah, it's just things are changing fast, and I guess new terms are popping up that people are just going to have to get used to. Te taiao is another one that's, the primary sector council started talking about, and we're just hearing that more and more. And people are just, as change happens at such a fast rate, there's some new language that comes in as well. So I think we'll wrap up today. Thanks everyone for joining us. So close to Christmas. If you're not on holiday yet, enjoy your last couple of days of work. So just to summarise, today we wanted to share stories about farmers who are interested in exploring options for land use diversification as a response to multiple challenges, and share some examples of how collaborating with consumers and businesses can help. If you missed any of the 3 previous webinars, you can find them in the news and events section at ourlandandwater.nz. And we'll send you a follow-up email tomorrow with a link to the video recording of this session, assuming the technical curse that this webinar has had hasn't extended to the video recording, and some links to some of the reports and things that we spoke about today. So thanks for coming, everyone. Thank you, Phil, Susan, Sam, and Tataru for sharing your work, and have a great Christmas break and summer holiday, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Annabelle.
Thank you.
Thanks, Annabelle.
Thank you.
Thanks. See ya.